from Psalms 66. Psalms 66. Verses 10 through 16. Psalm 66, verses 10 through 16. Would you read? Amen. You may be seated. A portion of verse number 12. We went through the fire, through the water, but you brought us out to rich fulfillment. I want to talk about this morning the other side of trouble. The other side of trouble. There was a movie that I greatly enjoyed that came out somewhere around 1994. It was called The Shawshank Redemption. In that movie, a young banker, in fact, a vice president of a bank in Portland, Maine. His name was Andy. And he was wrongly convicted of murdering his wife and her lover. He was sentenced to a life term at Shawshank State Prison. While in prison, he met another prisoner by the name of Red, played by Morgan Freeman. And Red was also serving a life term. Red picked out young Andy to be his first recruit who would more than likely buckle under the pressure of prison life. Because indeed for Andy, prison life was hard. For Andy endured frequent beatings and all of the ugliness of his incarceration. But Andy didn't crack because he knew he was innocent. And Andy never gave up hope that one day he would be free again. And after 19 years of incarceration, Andy crawled through a 500-foot sewage pipe to freedom. And when he fell out on the other side of that pipe to a river that had been overflowed with rain, Andy stood on his feet and raised his arms to the sky. And he allowed the rain to wash the filthy sewage from his body. Andy crawled through a river of sewage and came out clean on the other side. And brothers and sisters, in a very real sense, Andy's story is an appropriate metaphor for somebody's life in here this morning. Because Andy's story suggests that there is life and freedom on the other side of a bad situation. And the story reminds us that for every dark side of life, there's a bright side on the other side of it. And so today, I want to encourage somebody who may be presently dealing with a dark and painful situation in your life. You may be hurt, you may be confused, you may be discouraged and afraid. And so for some of us, you don't know what in the world to do. But I got some good news for you. And the good news is that you're going through whatever you're presently dealing with. Now, somebody missed that, because that for somebody that should have been a word of encouragement. Because the word through means there's an exit. Through means it won't last forever. Through means that there is another side. Do I have a witness? Well, Uncle Jake was walking down the street one day, and he was whistling and singing to himself. Somebody said to Uncle Jake, "Uncle Jake, what are you singing?" Uncle Jake said, "I'm singing my 5 favorite words." My 5 favorite words. Well, somebody said, "Well, Uncle Jake, what are your 5 favorite words?" He said, "My 5 favorite words are, and it came to pass." And they asked, "Well, why are these your 5 favorite words, Uncle Jake?" Uncle Jake said, "Because it didn't say, and it came to stay." And child of God, that's the question I want to ask today. Do you believe that you can get to the other side of through? And can I answer that question for you? Yes, you can. Because if you have the faith in the power and the faithfulness of God, you can get through whatever you're going through right now. Well, the ancient writer of Psalm 66 obviously knew what it means to get to the other side of his troubles. For the people of Israel had obviously come through a serious crisis that could have meant the end of their nation. But God delivered them. Brothers and sisters, the essential truth to this development of the psalm is the idea of thanksgiving to God because he delivered his people. That God brought his people through a terrible ordeal. Now, we're not certain who wrote Psalms 66. Nor are we certain of the precise situation that prompted this writing. Some believe that Psalms 66 was an exilic psalm that was written during the time when Israel was delivered from Babylonian captivity. Because if that is true, then the psalmist is simply expressing thanksgiving to God, who had brought a nation who looked like they were dead, dry bones back to life, as he returned them back to their homeland. But others suggest that this psalm speaks about the deliverance of the city of Jerusalem from the Assyrian siege, who in 701 BC, when Sennacherib, king of Assyria, and his Assyrian army had totally surrounded the city. Sennacherib demanded that the citizens of Jerusalem would surrender, but it was the prophet Isaiah who told King Hezekiah not to surrender. Why? Because God was going to deliver them. And one night, God sent one angel, and that one angel killed 185,000 Assyrians. And the next morning, when the sun arose, the ground was littered with thousands upon thousands of dead corpses of the Assyrian army. And if that is the occasion that prompted the writing of this psalm, then the psalmist is simply speaking of his national and his personal joy. Because a nation that was close to dying had been delivered by God. And my brothers and sisters this morning, here in Psalm 66, the psalmist is looking back through the rear view mirror of all of the troubles and the trials that his nation had gone through, but God had delivered him. But as he looks back at the trouble, he doesn't see the trouble that they had faced as the trouble that was sent to them by the devil. Oh no, but he seems to suggest that their trouble was because God had initiated him. Because he uses 6 second-person singular statements in order to express the trouble that God had brought them through. And when you read it, it seems that 5 out of the 6 statements seem to suggest that God was working against his own people. Listen to them in verses 10 through 12 as he says, "For you, O God, have tested us." Not the devil, but you, God, have tested us. In other words, you have allowed us to face these trials in our life. Look at it. You have refined us as silver is refined. Now, he's speaking metaphorically of silver being refined in the furnace in order to what? Purify it. It is suggested that according to ancient methods of purifying silver, that silver, unlike gold, requires a prolonged process of refining before it can ever be pronounced pure. And the writer says, you are the one, God, who allowed us to go through the fire of our trials. And it was you, God, who allowed us to stay in that fire longer than we wanted to be. You have brought us into the net. He seems to be saying, God, you are the one who allowed us to be entrapped and entangled by our enemies. You laid afflictions on our back. You see that word affliction? It means burdens. He said, Lord, you caused us to be crushed under the heavy weight of the heavy burdens of life. You have caused men to ride over our heads. He's suggesting that in ancient times, whenever a king defeated his enemies, he would drive his chariot over the bodies of the dead and the wounded enemies. And he would gallop over his enemies in order to further humiliate them. He said, God, you allowed our enemies to ride roughshod over us and to treat us in the worst way possible. And then he sums it up and says, we went through fire and we went through water. Speaking metaphorically, he's summing it all up by saying, Lord, you have allowed us to face one trouble after another, one problem after another. And God, if you allow me to be honest, I thought it was over. I thought we were doomed. I thought that there was no way that we were going to make it. And to make matters worse, God, I thought that even you had turned against us. Children of God, can I tell you that sometimes trouble, when you face it, you want to blame it on the devil? But the psalmist reminds us that sometimes it just could be God that's causing the trouble that he's allowing you to face. And it looked very dark up to now. But it wasn't until the middle of verse 12 that we see a light on the horizon. He says in verse 12, but you brought us to rich fulfillment. You see that phrase, rich fulfillment? It means what? Abundance. It means increase. It means overflow. It means liberty. In other words, God, in spite of everything that you brought on us, you are the same God that brought us through what we had to go through. Oh, I wish I had somebody. But you brought us to rich fulfillment. And the inference of the conjunction but there suggests that what they went through should have and would have, had God not intervened, destroyed them. But God brought them out. I wish I had a witness here. Look, if you will, at how bleak it looked on the left side of that conjunction but. On the left side of the but, the writer says that we were being tested. On the left side of the but, we were being refined in the fire. On the left side of the but, we were being ensnared and imprisoned. On the left side of the but, we had heavy burdens laid upon us. On the left side of the but, men were riding over our heads. On the left side of the but, we went through the fire and the water and all different kinds of trials. But all the good news is, he said, God, you didn't leave us on the left side of but you pulled us up. Oh, I wish I had a witness here. He pulled us up to the right side of but. Do I have a witness? Where there is rich fulfillment, where there is abundance, where there is wealth and prosperity, where there is favor and overflow. Am I talking to somebody that's stuck on the left side of the but in your life? Stuck because it looks like your life is over. Stuck because it looks like there is no way out. But can I speak to the child of God sitting in here? Tell you that the Lord sent me to tell you that if you can hold on to your faith, God will pull you up from the left side of your butt where there is doubt and despair to the right side of butt where there is God's favor, God's blessing, God's abundance. I wish I had a witness here. God wants to take you to the other side of through. Notice now, we got what the text is teaching us, that sometime God will allow us to go through some stuff. Whether he puts it on it or where he allows it, it's the same thing. You got to go through it. But what he wants you to do is he wants you to get a greater appreciation for what he done for you when he brings you through. Do I have a witness here? Oh. Notice that beginning with verse 13, that the psalm takes an abrupt turn. So abrupt was the turn that some believe that it's the beginning of an altogether different side. Notice in verse 13 that he moves from now second person, this is what you did to us, to first person, this is what I will do for you. He said, Lord, since you brought us to the other side of our troubles, to the other side of our pain, to the other side of our problems and our trial, God, this is what I vow. This is what I promise to do for you. And I believe, brothers and sisters, that the psalmist here is teaching us a valuable lesson about how we ought to respond to God when he brings us through our troubles. Because he said, when God brings you through, how ought you to respond? Here it is. When God brings you through, you should worship God. When God brings you through, you should worship God. Look at what he says in verse 13. I will go into your house with burnt offerings. Notice, when God brought Israel through the trouble, that the first thing that the psalmist said that he was going to do was go to the temple and worship God. And notice that the first expression of his worship